Morning, we'll start in a little while. Let's give it just another minute or so and then we'll start, guys. Hopefully more people will show up. Well, let's get started. If more people join, great. If not, I'm glad you're here. So as we enter the last week of class, I imagine things might be a little hectic, but I'm here to help you get through that. And let's see, a couple announcements, and then I want to talk about value at risk a little bit. So probably saw the Blackboard post about extra credit for course evaluations. Even if you don't need the extra credit, a good response rate is really beneficial to me on my end, and also your feedback helps me figure out how to make this teaching better. So if you have questions about how to complete the course evaluation, just let me know. But hopefully you can get it in. And again, I just appreciate it. Thank you for that. As we look at the syllabus, we're getting towards the end. The simulation assignment is due on Thursday. And then on Thursday, I'll also make I'll have the take-home exam available on Thursday, April 30th, and then it'll be due a week from Thursday, May 7th. So hopefully I think that should be plenty of time to get the take-home exam done. Any questions about either the last assignment or the exam, I suppose?
Would you mind if I asked a question about the financial planning assignment that's due tonight?
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no problem.
So I started doing it, and when in the videos, we had to find rate, but on the assignment, the rate's provided already, right?
Let's see. Let me open it up just to make sure. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, the rate of return we earn is given in the assignment.
So then, essentially, that first part where you find the rate, you don't have to do that. When you skip down to cash flow, they have 100,000 in savings, but they have another 20 years of working, but it doesn't tell us how much they make a year. So I wasn't sure where to go for that because I figured that they're going to need about $3.7 million for 30 years in retirement, which is 126,000 annually. But I don't know how I would put that in the. I mean, I put it in the cash flow, but like, does that make sense if there's only 100,000 in savings currently? I feel like I'm missing a step.
Yeah, so in question one, let's see, let me share it here. So in question one, it says, okay, you start with $100,000, right? And then you're gonna save for 20 years. So that's, and then you'll save, the client will save monthly. So that's 240 months of monthly savings. And then the idea was, like, this actually looks kind of like the first assignment in financial modeling where you find out, okay, what's the present value of all these monthly retirement expenses, right? How much will we have to save after retirement at the time we retire? And then you end up like solving for a payment here, a monthly payment, so that like the present value of the retirement savings needs as of the time the client retires becomes the future value in the payment that you end up finding. So if you take a look back at the first assignment from financial modeling, that might be helpful.
I'm gonna check that out. And then, do we still have financial planning class tonight?
Yeah, well, we'll touch base briefly, and then I'll give out the final exam in that class tonight. And then we'll have time, we can talk about it more tonight as well, for sure.
Okay, I'm gonna check out that first assignment again, and then hopefully I won't have questions, but if I do, I'll definitely be asking tonight. Thank you.
No problem. And I'm around during the day too, so if anything comes up, I'm around during the day as well. Any other questions about anything at all? All right. Well, let's look a little bit at value at risk because we talked about it in the videos, and one of the underlying assumptions throughout most of it was that returns are normally distributed, and that's a pretty common assumption in a lot of simulation analysis. The only problem with that is that returns don't usually look normally distributed, and so we just want to make sure. Well, let's illustrate that. So I'm going to work off of the value at risk spreadsheet that we discussed, taking a look at in advance of today's class, the one April 28th, value at risk complete. Let's open that up and share it. All right, well, I want to look at tail risk, right? Because you know, when we found portfolio value at risk, the Z-score or the mean variance method of finding value at risk assumes that portfolio returns follow a normal distribution, right? And normal distribution has pretty clearly defined shape. 1% of the time, we'll see an observation that's 2.33 standard deviations below the mean. Right? 5% of the time, we'll see an observation that's 1.645 standard deviations below the mean, and so on. But just a brief illustration of how returns are not normally distributed. This tab, tail risk, has about almost exactly 10,000 daily returns for the S&P 500, going back to August 1980. So what I want to do is look at the worst ones, the worst returns in this time series of daily daily stock market returns, right? So I'll just sort this ascending, make the columns a little wider, and then yeah, ascending. If we look at the worst returns in the last about 40 years, yeah, We can see the worst day was Black Monday in 1987. And then there's a couple recent ones, right? A few in the last month where the market was down over 7% in a given day. And so, you know, assuming that daily stock returns or any kind of investment return is normally distributed isn't always valid. And we just want to illustrate that here, right? So what I want to do actually, why don't we look at, let's see, let me highlight the recent bad returns. And let's just look at this one from March 9th as an example, right? We could turn this daily return is well below the mean, right? And we could actually turn it into a z-score, turn that observation into a z-score to see how many standard deviations below the mean is this observation, right? And that's what you do when you turn something like an observation into a z-score, which hopefully you did in maybe stats 2, and we're doing it right now. Right? X minus mu over sigma, the observation minus the mean over the standard deviation. And I'll post all this work when it's complete. I'll post a revised version of the completed spreadsheet to Blackboard. But this return from March 9th, 2020 is 6.8 standard deviations below the mean. Right? Average daily return is about 4 basis points. This is 6.78 standard deviations below that. So this is an incredibly negative return. And if returns were to follow a normal distribution, we should expect to see a return like this very infrequently. Does that make sense? And you know, the question is, well, how infrequently, right? Because you know, an observation that's 2.33 standard deviations below the mean, we should see about 1% of the time, once every 100 days. And then, anybody have any idea how we could figure out like how frequently we would expect to see a return that's 6.78 standard deviations below the mean? I've got a normal distribution, some bell curve. How often would I expect to see that? Well, maybe I'll show, let's use this like the z-score for the first percentile of the normal distribution to illustrate, right? Why don't we use the norm.s.dist function equals norm.s.dist is a function that's kind of like the inverse of the norm in function that y'all have been using to simulate. And so it takes a z-score as the first argument, and then the second argument, I always use true, cumulative distribution function, that's what we want. What it does is it returns the area under the curve to the left of this z-score, which is exactly what we want, right? And it should come out to be exactly 0.01 for this z-score, right? So the norm.s.dist function can tell us how frequently we would expect to see an observation like this. If we take the reciprocal of that, turns out to be 100 if it's the first percentile, meaning we should expect to see an observation 2.33 standard deviations below the mean about once every 100 days. So any questions on that so far? All right. Well, let's look over at this like bad return from March 9th, 2020, right? If we use the norm.s.dist function here, norm.s.dist, we can see what is the frequency that we should expect to see a return this low, a probability of some ridiculously small probability, yeah? If I take the reciprocal of that, it would be some huge number. We should expect to see a return this bad on average once every 163 billion days. And then if we take, there's about 255 trading days, 250 or 255 trading days in 1 year. So if we look at that on a yearly frequency, we should expect to see a return of, minus 7.6% or worse about once every 640 million years. Okay. So if returns follow a normal distribution, we shouldn't see this very often, right? Once every 640 million years, based on the shape of how a normal distribution looks. And then we've had 3 of these things that should happen only once every 600 some million years or more. 3 of these in the last month. So the takeaway is, daily stock returns definitely do not follow a normal distribution all that closely in the left part of the tail. So I bring this up for a couple reasons. First, one thing I usually harp on, always be aware of the assumptions that your model is. Okay. And then if we want to know, well, what should we do about it? Like, any ideas what we could do about this? How could, suppose I wanted to figure out, actually my retirement portfolio is invested mostly in stock indexes that the returns follow the S&P 500 pretty closely. I want to figure out the value at risk for my portfolio. And I know returns don't follow a normal distribution. What kind of things do you think I can do? Any ideas? So if the question is, if I'm interested in gauging the risk of my portfolio and I don't want to depend on a normal distribution, what kind of things can I do to figure out, like, the tail risk of my portfolio? Let's see. Let's go to the spreadsheet, huh? The random participation spreadsheet, unless there's a volunteer. Yeah. I'll open it up and share it. Here we go. So the question is, what can we do to evaluate the risk of a portfolio without relying on the assumption that returns follow a normal distribution? And our participant is going to be Caesar. Caesar, can you hear me? Earth to Caesar. Come in, Caesar. Ooh, well, the Random Participation Challenge has found its first victim who hasn't been able to rise to it. Let's try it again. Angelica, can you hear me? Angelica Murphy, come in. Nothing so far. Okay. We'll keep it going, all right? Kedrick, I believe, is not even on the call. Man. Milan. Nope, no dice.
Professor, before you end up getting to me, I am not sure how to approach this.
Well, Victoria, I appreciate you jumping in and saying something. Thanks. And you know what? Maybe we'll shut down the spreadsheet. Let's shut down the spreadsheet. I'll just make note of who did not participate. Here we go. But let's see, a couple things we could do. Instead of relying on the normality assumption, we could use just historical data, right, to find value at risk. Or we could simulate, if you're interested in this, you could simulate from a t-distribution. So if you're interested in simulating data from a probability distribution that's not normal, feel free to get in touch with me. But for now, I suppose we could look at the historical method, right, which doesn't assume a normal distribution. Or if you're interested in simulating from a t-distribution, which has fatter tails than a normal distribution, you could do that. So, all right. Well, a little bit of context around value at risk. To those of you that are here that can hear me with this call happening, I appreciate you following along with it. So why don't we? That's what I wanted to cover today. Why don't we use the rest of this time? I can take questions if folks have them, or yeah, I'll be on until the end of the call as usual. Anything we want to say while we're here in the group setting?
Yeah, can you do the t-distribution one that you were talking about, Professor?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Let's see. Yeah, why don't let me share the screen quick. So suppose, like, all right, so where's a good spot to do this? Here we go. I'll make a random number, just like we did when we simulated from a normal distribution. Oops. 0.29, for example. All right, so a normally distributed return, if I wanted to simulate a normally distributed return, we were using the norm.in function, right? So if we simulate some normally distributed return with a mean of 0.037% per year, per day, excuse me, and a standard deviation of 1.13, right? Simulate a normal return from this RAND function where the mean is 0.037% per day and the standard deviation of 1 point something percent per day. And then let me remove the formatting. So a normal distribution, a return simulated from a normal distribution looks like that. And now a t-distributed return, to do it, t.inv, right? So instead of norm.inv, we use t.inv, and then that takes as its argument a random number. And then the next thing is degrees of freedom is the next argument of the t-in function. So let's use something like, so as you add, so as the number of degrees of freedom in a t-distribution increases, it approaches a normal distribution. So if we use like a low number of degrees of freedom, just for illustrative purposes, maybe like 4, what comes out is a t-value, which is kind of like a z-value, right? And so what we need is, it's almost like the t-in function gives us this thing on the left-hand side of this equation. And so to do it, we've got to sort of back out the observation from this. So we have to do a little bit more work. So, and it ends up looking kind of like the value at risk formula, where it's like, okay, let's take the standard deviation and multiply it by the t-value and then add the mean. So the t-in function returns not like a value from the distribution itself, it returns a t-value. So anyway, if we multiply our simulated t-value by the the mean, or I mean by the standard deviation, and add the mean, what we end up with is a simulated return from a t-distribution that's just a little bit more extreme than what we would normally see from a normal distribution. So, and playing with like make, as you reduce the number of degrees of freedom, it makes the tail even bigger. So if we go down to 3, right, we've got negative 1.963% would be the simulated daily return from a t-distribution. Compare that to negative 1.49%. So for a given like randomly generated probability or percentile, 0.09 in this case, a t-distribution simulates a return that's a little bit more extreme because the tails are fatter. So that can be helpful when you want to simulate, well, what happens when things are bad, right? What happens when there's a pandemic? Well, returns don't follow a normal distribution, so maybe we should simulate negative returns from a t-distribution. So that's a brief overview of that. If you want to spend more, anybody got questions about it? If you want to spend more time offline with it, I'm happy to. Any other questions?
Not right now.
All right, great. Well, I'm sure you got a busy week ahead of you. I appreciate you coming, engaging with this. If there's anything I can do to help, feel free to get in touch. And then we'll plan to see you, most of y'all, this evening for financial planning.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you. Take care.
See you, Sammy. Thank you.